I was going to say good morning, good afternoon, actually. I'm Richard Fontaine, the president here at the Center for New American Security. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We're really pleased today to welcome Secretary of the Army, Mark Esper, to give some remarks here about the Army's priorities, about some of their modernization efforts and their human capital improvement efforts, and to talk about what's going on with the department and the broader set of challenges and opportunities that the Army faces today. I'm just going to tell you a bit about Secretary Esper's background rather than going through his entire distinguished biography, which you all probably know already, but he is the 23rd Secretary of the United States Army as of November of last year, which means he has responsibility for basically everything. Recruitment, organization, training, equipping, and care of 1.4 million active duty National Guard and Reserve soldiers, Department of Army civilians, and their families. During his distinguished career, Secretary Esper has worked in industry, he's worked at the Pentagon, he's worked on Capitol Hill, he served in the active duty Army and the National Guard and the Army Reserve, and has, I think, very possibly a uniquely broad set of perspectives on the challenges the Army faces today. The Army issued their sort of big six priorities for modernization. I think the Secretary may speak to those and some of these other issues here today. The way we're going to do this is Secretary Esper is going to give some prepared remarks, and then he will be joined in conversation by Susanna Bloom, our senior fellow and acting director of the defense program here at CNAS, and then we will open up that dialogue to some Q&A from the floor. So thank you all for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Secretary Mark Esper.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that introduction, and Susanna for moderating this today. When you said I'm responsible for 1.3 million people and everything they do, I think my heart skipped a beat there for a moment. I forgot about that. But it's great to be here today. It really is, not only to see Richard, who I've known for many, many years, but I feel pretty warmed up for this event after 2 hours yesterday before the Senate Appropriations Committee, raking me over the coals a little bit. Actually, it was a good conversation with the Congress to talk about our top issues. And but nonetheless, I always enjoy coming out here and talking with the think tank community, the press, and just sharing with what the Army is doing and where we're going. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that today, to share with you our modernization priorities, our vision for the way ahead, and how we intend to achieve that vision. But before I discuss the future, I want to talk a little bit about the past, because as many of you know, the strategic environment facing the Army today is not unique. We've seen this before. We've faced this before. You know, in 1973, the Army faced a strategic inflection point as well. We had just come out of the longest conflict in our history. The unrelenting tempo of the previous 8+ years had put an enormous strain on the Army. There was tension between defense and domestic spending, of course, political and social turmoil during those days. Our equipment, like today, was showing its age, and maintenance costs were increasing. And then we had challenges manning the force. Ultimately, though, this resulted in an Army that was not really prepared for the conflict it faced ahead. The high-end fight against the Russians, the Soviets at that time, focused on the Fulda Gap in Germany. So all this sounds familiar, right? As I said, we've been here before. Now, in light of those challenges the Army faced in 1973, visionary leaders like General Creighton Abrams recognized the need to change and to put the Army on a new course, a course to reform. The modernization efforts he and others outlined really required bold leadership, tough decisions, and really dogged persistence to see them through over the long run. But what they resulted in was air-land battle doctrine and a suite of technologically superior weapon systems that we all know as the Big Five. The Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Patriot air defense system, the Apache and Black Hawk helicopters, which I might add are still in service today, which speaks to the need for modernization. Now, fast forward 45 years later to 2018, and as outlined in the National Defense Strategy released earlier this year, we are now at another strategic inflection point. While the nature of war is immutable, the character of war is ever-changing. Evolving challenges primarily from Russia and China make it clear that we have entered an era of great power conflict, competition. That will be characterized by the following: increased speed and lethality, constant surveillance, increasingly dense urban terrain, denied access to the theater, disrupted communications and electronics, and threats in all domains: air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace. But despite this changing character of warfare, the Army's mission remains constant: to deploy, fight, and win our nation's wars. To this end, General Milley, the Chief of Staff, and I have developed the following Army vision, and I will read it to you. Quote, "The Army of 2028 will be ready to deploy, fight, and win decisively against any adversary, anytime and anywhere, in a joint, multi-domain, high-intensity conflict, while simultaneously deterring others and maintaining the ability to conduct irregular warfare." It's important. That was different from what we faced at the end of the Vietnam War. Further, the Army will do this through the employment of modern manned and unmanned ground combat vehicles, aircraft, sustainment systems, and weapons, coupled with robust combined arms, formations, and tactics based on a modern warfighting doctrine and centered on exceptional leaders and soldiers of unmatched lethality. So to achieve this vision, I've identified 5 objectives based on my Title X responsibilities. They are: man, organize, train, equip, and lead. And similar to a transmission synchronizing inputs through gears and producing a stronger output, these objectives will be achieved by, through, and with a new doctrine. That doctrine is based on multi-domain operations. So just like active defense evolved into air-land battle 40-plus years ago, alongside the reorganization of our infantry and armor units, the development of the Big 5 weapon systems, and the establishment of the combat training centers, 40-plus years ago, multi-domain operations will serve as that synchronizing mechanism going forward. So first, let's talk about manning the force. The Army must sufficiently man the Army of 2028. We must grow the regular Army above 500,000 soldiers with associated growth in the Guard and Reserve. And we must recruit and retain the very best. We are committed to that. We've already begun to make progress in this effort. We are working to grow the force by 7,600 soldiers this year and 4,000 next year. We are exceeding our retention objectives, and we are increasing deployability across the force. Second, we must be organized to face the high-end threat with both capability and capacity. We must ensure sufficient quantities of infantry and armor and engineers, field artillery, and air defense units exist to provide organic capability in each of our warfighting echelons. Our units from brigade through corps must be able to conduct sustained ground and air intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, electronic warfare, and cyber operations. And we must have aviation combat support and robust logistics assets available to all formations. 2 organizational changes you are seeing today are the establishment of the Security Force Assistance Brigades to help build readiness, and Army Futures Command, which promises to bring unity of command and effort to our modernization enterprise. So my third objective is training. Training must be tough and realistic and dynamic, and it must be frequent. That means sufficient repetitions to ensure the Army of 2028 will be ready for the battlefield of the future. We want soldiers to see practice training, practice fighting many, many times before they deploy. So our training must be focused on high-intensity conflict in urban terrain, under persistent surveillance, and in electronically degraded environments. In other words, do not count on having your communications gear, your electronics, etc. It must involve continuous movement to frustrate enemy observation and intelligence collection. It must incorporate battlefield innovation, and it must include combined arms maneuver with the joint force, as well as our allies and our partners. To achieve this, we are making changes to infantry basic training, and I've initiated an Army-wide review of training requirements, eliminating those that consume time without a commensurate benefit in increased lethality. So we are freeing up time for soldiers to focus on their core tasks. Fourth, to face the battlefield of the future, we must modernize our equipment. We have identified 6 modernization priorities, as Richard referenced, that in addition to advanced manned weapons and equipment, will work to develop autonomous, semi-autonomous, robotic, and AI systems to improve soldier lethality, effectiveness, and survivability. They are long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicles, future vertical lift, the network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. And fifth, finally, lead. A modern army manned with exceptional soldiers operating technologically superior equipment is only effective when properly led. In order to attract and retain the top talent necessary For meeting future threats, we must reform our outdated personnel system to one that does the following: develop smart, thoughtful, innovative leaders of character who are comfortable with complexity and capable of operating from the tactical to the strategic level. It must employ a talent management-based personnel system that leverages knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences of each individual. And it must offer flexible career models that are optimized to attract, identify, develop, and place talent where they will excel. To assist in this effort, I've established a talent management task force. We have met several times in the past 6 months that I've been in this role. And some of the reforms that we are working on include using programs such as the Integrated Pay and Personnel System for the Army. It's called IPSE, to form a talent marketplace matching soldiers and assignments based on requirements, but also on a soldier's knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences. We are also developing reform proposals to the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, DOPMA, and its counterpart, ROTMA, to allow more choice early in their career path, among many other things that we are discussing already with Congress. Next, it must use branch choice marketplace that currently being used by West Point and some ROTC institutions to best align officers to their branches. And we must go about reforming our stationing methodology to create more choice for the soldier, improving soldier retention and family stability. In closing, this is an exciting time for the Army. We have many challenges, but I'm confident that we will address them head on and overcome them. It will require leadership. It will require making tough decisions based on facts, and it will require persistence. We've been here before, and the Army is better for it. We are once again undertaking bold and comprehensive efforts to transform and prepare for an uncertain future. I assure you, the Army of 2028 will be ready. Thank you.
Well, Secretary Esper, I want to thank you again for taking the time to be here with us today and to have a little chat with me about some of the things you just described in your opening remarks. I'd like to start with a word that we've heard a lot lately, and that word is lethality. And by my tally, you mentioned it at least 5 times in your remarks just now. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what it means for the Army, and how we should expect to see that manifest in the coming years.
You know, the traditional definition that you learn in the Army for the infantry is the ability to close with and destroy the enemy. That's the bottom line. Lethality means you have a certain overmatched capability, whether it's in direct fire, indirect fire, your ability to maneuver on the battlefield. All those things, coupled with, again, leadership and good doctrine and sound tactics, make you more lethal on the battlefield. More likely that you'll win quickly, that you'll win with the least amount of cost to your own force, to your own soldiers, and that you'll be successful in achieving your mission.
And so, in your view, how has it changed? How has it changed over time? What does the current security environment mean for the concept of lethality?
Well, I think by definition, when you go from a battlefield, and we've been at war for 17 years, beginning in 2001, and continuing to this day in large measure, when you're in a low-intensity conflict, that's often marked by small arms and small caliber indirect fire systems, etc. But when you look at a high-end conflict, a conflict that you would face, again, with a strategic competitor such as Russia and China, you're looking at advanced militaries that have tanks and air defense systems and high-performance jet aircraft and bombers and all those things that really mark an extremely highly violent battlefield in which all domains are engaged and which you have to address threats from all over. The Chief of Staff is apt to say that the U.S. Army has not sustained casualties from enemy aircraft in decades. That's likely would not be the case if we were to go to conflict with the strategic competitors as the ones I'd outlined. So that is some of the definition, some of the color, if you will, to what marks a high-intensity, very violent, very lethal battlefield.
I'm glad you mentioned China and Russia, and in your opening remarks cited specifically the National Defense Strategy's emphasis on those two strategic competitors. And I wonder how you're thinking about balancing the kind of high-end capabilities that we're going to need to take on those challenges into the future against the size of the force, which you also indicated was growing. The numbers of the mass that you might need in a conflict, say, on the Korean Peninsula. How are you thinking about the need to balance those two factors?
Well, it's often said that capacity, quantity, if you will, is a quality in and of itself, and that's true, particularly for ground combat forces. So we clearly know we need to be above 500,000 soldiers. if simply just to fill out the units as they are now and to make them more robust for a different type of conflict. In the past 17 years, we've been focused on brigade combat teams. I think going forward in a high-end conflict, you'll see greater emphasis on division and corps level engagement. So we have to be prepared for that type of scenario, and I think to the degree to which we can make our systems more capable, and I think that involves, I know that involves leveraging autonomy, whether it's semi or full autonomy. If you can leverage that, if you can be there first on the battlefield with that capability, you have a chance to fundamentally change the character of warfare as we know it and gain an overmatch that could be uncontested for many years.
And so I think what I hear you saying is that we need to do both. Is that a fair characterization? We need to emphasize both those advanced capabilities and grow the size of the Army.
Oh, absolutely.
In order to meet those challenges.
Absolutely.
And so my question is, even with the significant increase in resources that Congress has provided in the latest budget deal for fiscal years 2018 and 2019, is it enough to do it all?
It's the increases we saw in 18 and certainly what we expect in 19 are enough. They're sufficient. But what's uncertain is what happens in 20 and 21, et cetera. So what we're trying to do is really gain control as much as we can of our own destiny by looking across the Army and going after a number of reforms, whether it's the size of headquarters, whether it is the how we do service contracts, certainly how we do acquisition, because what we want to do is free up time, money, and manpower. When I came into the job, I outlined 3 priorities immediately, and that was these 3 focus priorities were readiness is number 1, modernization is number 2, and reform is number 3. And reform is the means by which we free up time, money, and manpower to do the other 2 things, so that as we lean forward, I got 2 years. I like to say, as I've been quoted, you fix your roof when the sun is out, and I see sunshine for a couple of years. So we're going to do as much as we can to find money within our current budget, so that come 20, 21, 22, we've freed up money to do the modernization piece I'm talking about.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what those reforms may look like, or where you think those resources will come from?
Well, certainly on the acquisition front, if you can bring technologies to the field, to the force a lot quicker, you save money in terms of the time it takes. If you go about a system whereby you put much more emphasis on prototyping, leveraging current technologies, and not developing blue sky, white chart types of things, you save money on that front. On the other hand, we're also looking at very hard, and we will, ending some programs, slowing some programs down, maybe condensing some programs that are of lower priority than those that fit inside the 6 modernization priorities. It's just something we have to do if we're going to be serious about our modernization efforts and make the money available to do it.
So further to that point about lower priority programs and how you kind of think about those, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see the kind of counterterrorism campaign in the Middle East evolving. The National Defense Strategy was clear, and Secretary Mattis has been clear in his remarks since that we need to continue to pursue those missions. But do you see a change in the way that the U.S. Army prosecutes those types of threats in response to the new prioritization?
Well, I'll leave the warfighting piece to the combatant commanders, but speaking to the Title 10 role that I have, one of the remarks I made in my opening was that unlike at the end of the Vietnam War, when the Army regrouped, it really focused on how do we, again, fight the Soviets in Europe. And we just put Vietnam and low-intensity conflict in a rearview mirror. We can't afford to do that now. Irregular warfare, counterterrorism will be with us, regrettably, for many, many years. And so we have to maintain that edge. We have to retain those hard-earned lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have to maintain those capabilities. That's why the vision is very clear in saying we have to maintain our irregular warfare capabilities. And we'll still have the Joint Readiness Training Center and other readiness centers to make sure that we fine-tune and exercise and test those skills. So that is not a skill set, a mission, if you will, that is going away. It's something that we will continue to practice and continue to refine and continue to train for.
But in terms of kind of sending more units through, CTC versus kind of a counterterrorism specific, I guess I wonder how you're thinking about the readiness of the force for the full spectrum conflict versus for those low intensity missions specifically.
Well, folks who were in the Army 5-10 years ago will tell you that if you went to the NTC, you really didn't do high intensity conflict. At least not like what I went through when I was a young platoon leader in the 101st Airborne Division or a company commander in the Airborne Battalion. But we're getting back to that. One of my first trips was out to the National Training Center in November of last year, and I was really excited to see the first Cav was going through. They were dealing with opposing forces and vehicles. They were dealing with drone threats that were conducting surveillance and then calling in fires on their positions. So they were seeing the type of threats that the Ukrainians saw in the Donbass, and they were seeing the type of threats that we would anticipate to see in future conflicts. So all that is happening now at NTC. It's happening also at the Joint Maneuver Readiness Center in Germany. But what you also see in the course of the lead up to those battles, you'll still see civilians and refugees on the battlefield. You'll see some irregular type of warfare actions perpetrated against our forces as they move into the theater, if you will. So again, we recognize that we're not going to abandon what we learned over the last 18 years. Rather, we have to relearn those high-intensity skills, warfighting capabilities that we've really, it's been a hallmark of the U.S. military since for many decades.
I think I'd like to follow up on two of your comments there. First, how is the Army doing on readiness relative to when you assumed the secretaryship? Are you seeing an improvement already in your tenure, or where are we?
Absolutely. We've seen significant progress in the last year, and certainly I've seen it in the 6 months I've been on board. Going back to when the Chief of Staff first really made that pivot to do that. So we're seeing a lot of growth. It was helped by the 17 budget. The 18 budget really furthers that. And again, if the 19 budget comes through as the agreement was made, we should see continued gains. And so our game plan is to hit that readiness mark around 2022 or so. And at that point in time, we can really go into a sustainment mode, if you will, in terms of maintaining that high level of readiness and focus on procuring that future force and doing what we need to do on the modernization front.
Sure. And did the extra resources in 2018 and 2019 kind of accelerate that timeline to get you to 2022?
Well, they help assure that we will get to that timeline. The additional monies we've seen for O&M allow us to, again, not just do training, but do the maintenance piece of that. And with our 2019 budget, what we're going to do is fully fund, maximize all of our CTC rotations. So you'll see going through 20 CTC rotations, 16 of which will be from active duty regular Army forces and another 4 from the reserve component. So we're maximizing our throughput through those centers. We plan a series of other exercises to accompany that to help enforce our ability to deploy the force. And then, like I said, we're doing a lot more at home station. I'm trying to lift mandatory training that distracts the soldier off their backs so they can do a lot more at home station before they ever get to the training center or before they ever deploy to Europe or Korea or Kuwait, wherever they may be going.
Yeah. And I also wanted to follow up on your comment about Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how have you and how's the Army changed the way it's thinking about training against high-end competitors, specifically Russia, based on what we learned watching the conflict in Ukraine unfold?
Well, we took lessons from the Ukrainian conflict and talking to the Ukrainians and others, and we know that the Russians made good use of drones. They used them again not just for surveillance, but to call in indirect fires with devastating effect. We know that they have good electronic warfare capabilities, and they can not just intercept but jam our communications. So it's one of the reasons why with regard to our network, our battlefield network, we had to pivot. We called the halt, fix, and pivot to a network that is much more reliable, much more mobile, that could defeat that type of jamming, if you will, and survive. But nonetheless, you have to supplement that with training. And in training, we're telling our units, hey, look, if you're going to go out and train, there's at times you're going to have to shut down that network, turn off your radios, and learn to go back to the old way of hand and arm signals or using wire between positions. Those things that are more safe, if you will, more reliable in the type of a high-end conflict that we would expect to see.
So we can expect to see more training occurring in a communications degraded environment.
Absolutely. What I like to tell folks is that at best, your communications will be interrupted.
Right.
At worst, you'll have none.
Right.
So.
Great. Changing tacks just a little bit, there have been some recent DoD studies showing that shoulder-fired heavy weapons, such as the Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, cause short-term cognitive defects in some service members, even when the firing of those weapons happens within allowable limits in training. And these findings are troublesome to the community of folks in the military now or who have left recently who are experiencing some of these effects. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the Army is doing to adapt training to address this problem, to monitor exposure to blast, to better protect our soldiers?
Sure. Well, our first responsibility as leaders in the Army is to take care of your soldiers. And I think we've always been very conscious of that. I remember when I first entered the service, we were really starting to realize about hearing protection and making sure that you had hearing protection when you're on a firing range or in some type of multi-live fire complex. So I think it's a good point about the blast, the effects of blast effects on the brain, the concussions that it may create. So, based on DoD studies, I know CNAS did a study on this as well. I think there's some good points in there about how do we monitor, how do we gauge the blasts, how do we monitor that, how do we track it with a soldier, do follow-up studies in the short term. Also, how do we employ the weapon systems and track them? Can we make them so that they are less impactful, if you will, to the human body? And then in the long term, really do the medical research. In the near term, we just got to be much more conscious of that fact and make sure we do everything we can to protect the soldier, because they are, our most important asset, if you will.
Yeah. So would you support increased monitoring of blasts, particularly in the training environment?
Well, I think we need
as
to.
a first step?
I think we need to monitor our soldiers, because we owe them that much, and we need them. I mean, they're valuable assets. You can't afford to not do that. So we need to monitor them. We need to monitor the training and understand all those effects better, and look for ways to mitigate it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Sticking kind of with the soldiers for a second, we talked a little bit about the number and need to grow the Army. My understanding is that the Army is struggling to meet its original recruitment goal for this year. And I look back to examples from, say, the first tech boom in the 1990s, where the military had a very hard time recruiting against a booming private sector economy. Our economy is very nearly at full employment now, and so I wonder what you see as the challenges in growing the Army, to at least 500,000 in the active component, and how you'll mitigate some of those.
Well, it's a historical fact that the military always has a more challenging time when the economy is robust, and fortunately we have a robust economy. That's the good news. So we have to do everything we can to attract that talent, those kids out there who are interested in military service. I was reading a study from another institution where it said that many soldiers join because they're encouraged by their family, and because they're seeking either adventure or travel or service. Those are some things you can't get from parts of the private sector economy, or they're looking for the occupational development, those skills. So we have to tap into that talent. It is a challenging year, but I'm confident that we can, over time, we'll get above that 500,000 threshold, and we'll do it without sacrificing quality. And that's something I'm digging into and turning the rheostats, if you will, as I look at the data, and to make sure that we have very capable, very qualified soldiers who want to spend a career, hopefully, at least a first term or two in the service, and we'll get there.
And so, have I understood correctly that you would not consider waivers for things like lack of education or criminal background or?
Well, waivers are very highly misunderstood. Waivers are just a second level of review, if you will. So we don't. None of the services can break the DoD standards when it comes to education or ASVAB or Category 4 personnel. So, for example, with Category 4. Based on your testing, you cannot have more than 4% of your service members who are above that number. We've raised the bar. We've said we're not going to allow more than 2% in the Army. I did that 3 months ago, I think. So we're raising the bar in that regard. Now, waivers cover any number of categories, whether it's medical or conduct or whatnot. If we've talked about this before. If there's a waiver for drugs and alcohol. So if a young kid says, yeah, I grew up in California and smoking marijuana is legal there, and I did it once at a party when I was in 8th grade and I didn't like it, he has to report that as part of his application process. And then it goes to a higher level review. And it's at that point where you could say that it's given the time, the single occurrence, where the case may be, you are still eligible to serve. And there are other cases where you get misdiagnoses. So we've had cases, any number of anecdotes. I've seen it. Kids for excessive nail biting are characterized as an anxiety disorder, right? You have other kids who come in, they have scars on their legs, and you find out later that it was due to they were skateboarders when they were young, and they cut themselves up. And so you really got to take a look at what's underlying the data when we say waiver. Again, there's a good deal misunderstood. we view it as a higher level review. At the end of the day, we won't and can't sacrifice, breach those DoD standards. And in fact, in the Army, we are raising the standards, and you'll see more of that over time, I assure you.
I think we just have a few minutes left before we turn it over to the audience, but I wanted to circle back to this idea of multi-domain battle, which is something else we've heard a lot about in recent years, even prior to the beginning of this administration. And so I wonder if you can kind of put it in a historical context. Do you view it as a natural extension of air-land battle, air-sea battle, this is what's next? Or is this really a more revolutionary kind of way of thinking about how to employ the joint force?
Well, I grew up under air-land battle, so I knew it fairly well. In many ways, it is an extension in terms of how you fight, but it's different in many ways too. Of course, there are more domains by its definition, multi-domain. But what it really calls for is how do you think about fighting not just in space and cyberspace, but as you think about supporting our sister services. And I talk a good deal with the Secretary of the Air Force and Secretary of the Navy about this. How can and this was a tenet of air-land battle, how do you use Army indirect fires, Army artillery, if you will, to suppress enemy air defenses? So if I can shoot enemy air defenses using ground-based artillery, if I can suppress them, that helps the Air Force get up and achieve air dominance. The same goes, though, for the Navy. If I can shoot across domains, if I could cover a sea lane of communication, a strait, if you will, using Army artillery, hold enemy ships at bay because they know I could severely damage, if not sink them, that helps the Navy clear a path forward. And so we're thinking about that all the time, is how do we get our leaders to think about working across multiple domains, and then how do we get them to think about, again, these new domains. One of the things that's new that we're working on right now as we think about our formations is where do you put cyber? We think about cyber strategically, but cyber is going to be a factor on the battlefield, and not just defensive. It could be offensive as well. So your core commander, you may find that in your tactical operations center, you not only have a fires desk and an engineering component, but you now have a cyber person working there as well. And that cyber person, staff officer, is responsible for planning your cyber component of your battle. So those are the things we have to think through as we make the formations more robust again, not just returning the things we pulled out like air defense and electronic warfare, but putting new things back in to make them as robust, as lethal as possible.
Great. Well, thank you for those comments. I think we'll turn it over to the audience now for their questions, and we have a couple microphones coming around, I think. We'll start right here on the aisle. On the aisle, Melanie. Sorry, and if you could just identify yourself.
I can hear you.
I'm Sir George Nicholson, the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. You sort of alluded to it, but about 2 years ago, I was at a session with General Mellon, Marine Commandant. He said, my biggest concern for Marines in the future, my biggest threat is our dependence upon satellites, GPS, and SATCOM. I asked him again last year, and he's still got the same problem. Along the same lines, I asked him 2 weeks ago, he says, I'm going to add something to that package. He said, the first time since 2011, I, as the commandant, sat down with the staff of the Air Force, and they were talking about, you alluded to it earlier, about we've never lost anybody on the battlefield. He said, I'm concerned about RPDs, armed RPDs out there, and what that kind of threat. I've seen recently something open source reporting that the Army is working on equipping strikers with that kind of capabilities. How much of a threat do you see, like General Miller's talking about, future huge threats to the Army of being a proliferation of armed RPDs?
Yeah, I think remotely piloted vehicles will be a real thing. We're exercising against them now at the National Training Center. And so you're correct. As part of our, one of our 6 modernization priorities is air and missile defense. And so we're going to deploy in Europe beginning in 2020 a battery of strikers that are modified to use traditional interceptors to shoot down not just enemy aircraft, but also to be able to defeat enemy drones. And one of the things is, as I look ahead, because we want to continue to improve incrementally these vehicles, these capabilities as we go, is we're making sure that as we build those, that we have sufficient room on the vehicle and power so we can put directed energy, lasers if you will. And that gives us incredible capability, an unlimited magazine almost, to defeat those types of threats, because they will be many and they will be hard to detect and defeat. And you can't get caught in between loading missiles back up on your rails, if you will. So that is a capability that we're building, and we're restoring to the force, which is why we got to move quickly to do these types of things.
Hi, Mr. Secretary, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. You've talked on multiple occasions about the importance of the Big Six, that every program not falling under those 6 categories is going to stand some very tough scrutiny. I was thinking in particular of some of the programs that were started under the last administration to improve the light infantry formations, which are no longer perhaps the same focus they were. For example, JLTV, the ground mobility vehicle, the mobile firepower sort of light tank, light reconnaissance vehicle. Those programs to improve the mobility of the IBCT, particularly the airborne. Are those still high priorities, if not in the Big Six category? Or are those sort of the kinds of things that are going to be looked at for potential cuts?
Well, we will look at everything we need to, but clearly the GLTV has shown itself to be successful so far. We'll probably move to a production decision later this year, and we'll need that capability in the force. But there's the Army has hundreds of programs, and we got to rack and stack those and start from the bottom up and really take a look at where we can again free up money to put them back into the top tier programs. So we're beginning that process now. It's been underway, but I'll be taking first looks at it here pretty soon alongside the chief.
IBCT programs, MPF, LRV, GMB, do you have a sense of where they stand right now?
I believe we still need mobile protective firepower for our light forces, for our airborne forces. So again, while everything will get looked at, I think there are other things out there that will get a tougher look, if you will.
Just over here.
Hi, Secretary. Megan Myers, Army Times. So you mentioned reducing some of the non-DoD mandated training on the force. What are some of the other, aside from the ones you've already released, what are some of the other training programs you're targeting, and when can commanders expect to see those memos?
We're putting out memos weekly to do that. We have a list. We just need to make sure we vet it and update our own policies as we go. I've already given our broad brush guidance to the commanders. If it doesn't advance your readiness, lethality, effectiveness, and it's not required by law, then they have the freedom to make the judgment. But I also want to back that up with paper, and we'll continue to do that. And it's not just training requirements. It's the additional duties that we impose on junior leaders. It's the reporting requirements up to battalion and brigade and division and army, that those types of things that, again, keep people in offices, keep people behind computers and not out in the field training. So there are a number of things we'll be doing along those same fronts to make sure we capture it all.
What are some examples of ones that you still want to target?
Well, the one I've already given folks relief on that probably doesn't fit in either of those categories is our system by which soldiers request leaves and passes. It's called TRIPS. And a computer-based program that takes anybody 10 plus minutes and requires multiple forms, and it really takes the chain of command out of the loop. I've said that's no longer required, and every time I say that before a crowd of soldiers, the cheers go up. So there you go. There's one.
Just here on the aisle.
Hi, Andrew Herr, Helicase. As you talk about having exceptional soldiers, thoughtful, innovative people, what's your thought process on performance enhancement technologies, certainly legal ones and ethical ones, especially considering the PEO soldier will tell you they don't do that, PEO soft warrior will tell you they don't do that, and the current Office of Surgeon General, other medical commands have been very hesitant to move in that direction.
You mean like drugs?
No, like supplements, sleep tools, meditation, these other programs that have been demonstrated to work in your population but are not.
Well, let me speak to what I know we're doing. And this is to improve the fitness of our soldiers and their deployability. And that is, we are planning and budgeting to put into all of our maneuver battalions a nutritionist, a sports trainer, and a physical therapist. And the game plan is to treat our soldiers like professional athletes. So you teach them how to do exercises properly, teach them how to eat properly, how to adjust their diet based on what they're trying to achieve, and if they get injured, get them back on the battlefield quickly. Now we have some units that are doing that already, and I will also tell you that when I was at Fort Drum doing physical training with the soldiers of the 10th Mountain ID, I was doing some exercises, and I had a trainer come up to me and give me advice this and there. So it's real; they're out there actually helping now. And when I asked the unit further about this, because we'd already been discussing it at the Pentagon, They said, yeah, initially as they changed their PT regimen and as they brought these additional folks in to help, they saw an increase in injuries, but it immediately plummeted. And they saw their fitness and their readiness rates go up because of how they adapted their training and how they brought these other folks into the game. So.
All the way in the back there, Melody. Further back, behind you.
I thought he was giving the 5 minute.
You may take 5 minutes on this question. Richard Resher, Booz Allen. You mentioned the headquarters reform. You also mentioned the Stand Up the Future Center. Without getting into pre-decisional information, how do you see synchronizing the potential movement of functions out of the headquarters into the Futures Command as part of that integrated set of processes?
Well, like a doctor, we want to do no harm, so it'll be very deliberate, very thoughtful, very methodical. That's why we said that Army Futures Command will stand up this summer initially, and it'll be fully operational next summer in 19. So, and there will be adds and subtractions as we go in terms of organizational structure once we get the folks together, once the commanders in place and all that. So, again, we want to make sure as we move to a new way to tackle modernization and improve our acquisition that we don't do any damage or any harm to any other piece of the system. For the most part, people are not moving. It's just changing the reporting lines, if you will. So there will not be that disruption that you often see in terms of changes. But this will nonetheless be the biggest change in the Army in 45 years with regard to its organization.
Thanks for your service, Mr. Secretary. T.J. Stapleton, Stapleton and Associates. Sir, when you work the Hill, most of the staffers who write the bills really like the 6 issue areas that the Army's identified, the technical areas. But they have a real problem with setting up a separate futures command. The bureaucracy, the cost, we have a big bill for that. And many of them say it's a distraction. It really takes away from what you're trying to accomplish in these other areas. Could you comment on that?
Sure, I've actually heard the opposite. We talk a good deal to the defense committees, for the most part very supportive of our plans, whether it's standing up Futures Command and what it intends to do in terms of providing unity of effort, focus, et cetera, and how other ways we intend to reform the acquisition system. So there's been actually nothing but support as far as I've heard. With regard to bureaucracy, we've been stripping bureaucracy out of it. So currently, as we leverage our cross-functional teams, we've gone from what used to be a 12 or 13 layer process to a 3-layer process. And with regard to the cost, I've committed, and we're all committed to not the establishment of Futures Command will not include net growth in terms of headquarters personnel. In fact, we're going to go in the opposite direction overall. So again, I've heard nothing but support on the Hill for the most part with regard to our plans.
Down here in front, Melody.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Courtney McBride from Inside the Army. The Army submitted its comprehensive modernization strategy to the Congressional Defense Committees, and it seems as though the strategy lays out a broad image of the future operational environment and some of the sort of overall capabilities as outlined in the 6 modernization priorities, but it doesn't really indicate what you will need in order to fight and win in that future environment in terms of actual systems in a way that the Big 5 did with airline battle. So is there, are you experiencing resistance on the Hill or elsewhere from that, or is there kind of a timeline for when some of those broad needs are going to translate into actual systems?
Well, I guess I'll have to go back and reread the document to see what you're seeing there. I will tell you that we believe it does. So, for example, 2 of the Big 5 were Bradley and Abrams. And so what we've said is we need next generation combat vehicles. The first will be a replacement for the Bradley. And once we get that underway, then we'll look at the Abrams and so on. So clearly we want to do that. Next year we'll be prototyping at least 2 vehicles, maybe 3 as the Bradley replacement. And then we'll move forward from there in terms of picking one and moving on. Same thing with future vertical lift. Air and missile defense I already spoke to. You'll see that vehicle come out in 2020, and then we'll build upon that as well. But if you're looking for it's this vehicle and that's the one, no. I mean, the Bradley was a development program, and we're committed to not going that route. That route in the past has proven to be timely and costly, and not didn't meet the timelines that we really needed to fill the force. So.
The concern is that they're just going to continue to be ECPs for existing systems.
No, we can't.
Continue to sort of fluctuate
We can't. The Bradley doesn't have the power or other things to continue doing that. And even if it did, the Abrams has a little bit more room. We can hold off a little bit longer, but we can't afford to do that. What we want to do is get a new platform that we know we can continue to build upon and upgrade over time for decades. That's not the case right now for the Bradley. So.
Secretary Justin Rubin, Casualties, Pets and Tours. In that vein, as the Army digs out of the modernization challenge it has and the cuts it did, how do you use COTS, foreign COTS, to try to meet those goals, but also ensure that POs who tend to want to develop their own capabilities buy into that process and aren't pushing back to keep with their developmental programs?
Well, we spend a lot of time, my senior acquisition executive does, with the PEOs and PMs. We've been very clear that our approach is, again, not to look for timely, time-consuming, costly new development programs, but rather, let's look out to the commercial, to the traditional defense industry, the commercial sector, particularly with regard to the network. We have to with regard to communications, and then with regard to vehicles, we are looking to, foreign suppliers want to come in, or our foreign partners come in. I have no problem with that. I mean, if you look, some of the more successful vehicles, the Stryker was a foreign-made vehicle. So we got to look at all those, because I don't want to go white sheet, long-term development program, years to determine requirements, all that. We need to go with what we can assemble now in the next 2 or 3 years. And then once we hit that readiness around the 22 timeframe, start really putting money into procurement in around 21, 22, 23 to start fielding by 28, which again was the vision I outlined.
Over here in pink and then purple.
Hi, Lara Seligman with Aviation Week. I wanted to ask you about future vertical lift. Do you see any opportunities to accelerate that? And what are you learning so far in terms of the demonstrator efforts that are ongoing?
We know our aviation fleet right now is in pretty good shape. There is room to continue upgrading those. I think those technologies are underway. It's a good example of a partnership between us and industry. So industry, for every $3 or $4, for every dollar we put in, they're putting in every 3 or 4. As I recall, one of the aircraft is flown, the other one will be flying. And so, there's some more time on the clock for that one. But it's promising in terms of what the producers think they can get in terms of range and speed and performance. And again, that's what we need going forward. We need to expand the range and the performance envelope, if you will, of our current vertical lift systems. If I can, we will. But I'm just not fluent in terms of where we are. I usually get briefed every week on a different CFT, so it's been a while. But if we can, we will. We need to accelerate, and I'll find the money. But first priority, though, is long-range precision fires. I mean, the order I list them in is the order that we know we need that capability.
Hi, Secretary Ashley Rookey with Shepherd Media. You had talked a little bit about the evolving multi-domain battlefield, and yesterday before the Senate Appropriators, you talked about it again as it related to the Pacific region, specifically China, and the Army's evolving role. Can you talk a little bit about discussions that are ongoing about potential training and equipment changes that could be coming down the pipeline as it relates to this issue?
Well, I think, a good example of multi-domain operations in the context of what I spoke earlier, let's just say in terms of a naval context, we're looking at hypersonics as really a strategic game changer when it comes to long-range precision fire. So if I can develop a system that can shoot a round or a projectile or a hypervelocity vehicle hundreds of miles, that gives us an incredible capability to reach out and, if not hurt an adversary, hold them at bay. So it's a game changer if I could do that. It gives me extreme overmatch when it comes to range to do that. So that's the one example that comes to mind as we've thought through scenarios to do that. Well, we got more work to do on that strategic level when long-range precision fires. Now, systems like the PALT and PIM program, we'll continue to improve that. In terms of training, I think the most immediate thing is I am putting emphasis on training in an environment where you don't have access to all the electronics and stuff, and how do we do that in this day and age. And then the other part of this is getting those indirect fire assets maneuvering again on the battlefield. and working in support of brigades and divisions.
And last question, here in the blue suit, purple tie.
Hello, Justice Bennett from Defense Systems Journal. I was just wondering, as you said that we might see more engagements at the division or corps level, do you think that the role of small level officers or small unit officers will be diminished in the future as well?
No, I don't think so. I mean, many battles are fought at the platoon and company level. And so, and for the Army, it's the essence is the squad and the tank crew, if you will. So no, I think if anything, we're putting more emphasis on the lethality and effectiveness of the soldier and the squad. And so we'll continue to build that. One of our 6 priorities is soldier lethality. We're putting a lot of effort into protective equipment, night vision, new weapons, synthetic training to do that. So no, I don't think it'll diminish it. I think just what it means is as you start looking at returning to the division and corps level of warfare, you're looking at how do you employ these much broader assets that are not the responsibility of a company commander or a battalion commander. So it gets into cyber or general support fires or long range reconnaissance, all those types of things that typically reside at that level of warfare when you're in a high intensity conflict.
Great, well, thank you very much again for joining us today here at CNAS. Secretary Esper has agreed to do a very short huddle with any members of the press who are here. That will occur in the corner conference room, which is just behind this room here. And so, thank you very much.
Good,
again.
thank you.